The town was a place where the air always smelled of pine needles and damp earth, a scent as comforting and predictable as the turning of the seasons. Tucked away in a fold of the forested hills in Maine, its population hovered just north of 2,000 souls, give or take a few transient summer folks or college kids who decided the big city wasn't for them. Life here moved at the measured pace of a grandfather clock, steady and unhurried. The biggest news in a given week was a bumper crop of blueberries, or old Mrs. Gable's prize-winning zucchini at the county fair. It was a place where folks still left their doors unlocked at night, where kids rode their bicycles down Main Street without a parent's anxious gaze, and where a handshake was as good as any written contract. That spirit of provincial calm, that unwavering predictability, was something Sheriff Jack Hansen cherished more than he'd ever admit out loud. He'd spent 20 years of his life walking these streets, patrolling these quiet roads, and helping to keep that peace. Jack was a man built like a sturdy oak, not given to quick movements or hasty words. His face, etched with the fine lines of 48 years, spoke of a life spent mostly outdoors under the broad Maine sky. His uniform, though always meticulously pressed, sat on him with the comfortable ease of an old friend. He knew this town. He truly did. He knew its quirks, its rhythms, its secrets, the way a man knows the back of his own hand. He had seen it all, or so he had thought. The occasional petty theft, a few too many domestic disputes fueled by cheap beer, the lost tourist who confused the deer path for a shortcut to the highway. He took a quiet pride in his competence, in the knowledge that he was good at what he did, that he understood the ebb and flow of this little world he'd sworn to protect. The biggest challenge usually involved coaxing a raccoon out of someone's chimney or mediating a dispute over property lines. It wasn't the kind of job that made for exciting stories in the big city papers, and Jack liked it that way. He liked the quiet hum of normalcy, the sense that everything was exactly where it should be. Then the calls started coming in, like discordant notes in a familiar melody. It began subtly, a trickle of reports from the farmsteads scattered on the outskirts of town. First, Old Man Hemmings reported a heifer missing. Just one. He had left her in the north pasture the night before. Come morning, she was gone. No tracks, no broken fences, just gone. Then the Callahans, a couple of miles west, lost a half-dozen sheep. This time there was damage. The wooden rails of their enclosure splintered. Something burst through them with impossible force. Not torn down, but exploded outward. The local gossip circuit immediately jumped to wolves or a bear that had strayed too far from the deep woods. But Jack had walked those woods, studied animal behavior for years. A wolf snatched a sheep, certainly, but it would not obliterate a fence like that. And a bear, even a big one, left a distinct path of destruction, a trail. There was no trail here. Just the gaping maw of the broken fence and the baffling absence of the animals. The livestock was not just gone. It had vanished, swallowed by the very air. These incidents, scattered at first, felt disconnected, yet beneath their surface, an uneasy pattern began to form, a puzzle with too many missing pieces. Jack found himself staring at the smudged photographs from the Callahan farm, a knot tightening in his gut. The ripped boards, the strange indentations in the soft earth were not paw prints, nor were they boot prints. They defied logic, defied his 20 years of accumulated experience. There were no witnesses, no discernible tracks, no hair samples, no discarded cigarette butts from joyriding teenagers. Nothing to latch onto, nothing to follow. Just destruction and inexplicable disappearances. He tried to catch smoke with a fishing net. The frustration was a slow, corrosive burn, wearing at the edges of his calm. He felt a nagging sense of inadequacy, a feeling that had last surfaced during his first shaky weeks as a rookie deputy. This was not a drunk driver or a petty thief. This was something else, something that slipped through the cracks of his understanding, leaving only a residue of disquiet. He spent longer hours at his desk, poring over maps, trying to chart the incidents, to find a connection, a logic, a reason. But the map remained stubbornly blank, refusing to yield its secrets. Among the townsfolk, the whispers started, a soft rustle then growing louder, carrying on the wind. Old wives' tales resurfaced, stories of the deep woods and things that should not be. Jack, a practical man, dismissed them as rural gossip, the usual superstitions that emerged when folks got scared. But even he acknowledged the subtle shift in the town's atmosphere. The easy camaraderie frayed. People started pulling their curtains tighter at night. Gates that had swung freely for decades were now chained and padlocked. Folks who had once strolled aimlessly after supper now hurried home before dusk, their steps quick and purposeful. Children, once free to roam the fields until the streetlights flickered on, were now called inside earlier, their laughter replaced by an unsettling silence after dark. The familiar faces in the general store looked paler, their smiles more forced. Jack saw it, felt it, a chill wind blowing through the once sturdy house. Then came the specific, unignorable reports, not from the usual town criers, but from solid, sensible farmers, men and women whose feet were planted firmly on the earth. They spoke of strange, low, drawn-out howls echoing from the forests at night. These were not the sharp, quick bark of a fox, nor the mournful call of a wolf, nor the familiar baying of a dog. These were different, deeper, more resonant. They vibrated in the very bones, stirring something ancient and primal, a fear that had no name or explanation. Jed Miller, a man who had seen a lot of things in his 70 years, heard one last Tuesday. It was right outside his bedroom window. He swore it was not an animal he knew, swore it sounded like the very soul of something lost and angry. Jack rationalized it, attributing the sounds to coyotes or a hungry bobcat, but the reports continued, too consistent, too unsettling. The sounds were wrong. The sounds were new. Jack felt the pressure building, a slow, relentless squeeze. His tools, honed over 2 decades, were inadequate, dull, useless. His experience, once a source of pride, was a lead weight, tethering him to a reality that no longer applied. He had no answers. The townspeople, their eyes haunted and expectant, looked to him for reassurance, for solutions, for a return to the normalcy he'd always guaranteed. But he had nothing to offer but platitudes that rang hollow in his own ears. The placid calm of the town, the one he so cherished, dissolved like mist in the morning sun, replaced by a creeping dread. He felt a cold, hard knot of fear in his own chest. Whatever was out there was beyond his understanding, beyond his control. The quiet hum gave way to a low, unsettling growl, and Jack knew, deep in his bones, that it would only get louder. The delicate fabric of his world stretched, thinned, threatened to tear. The incidents, once sporadic and confined to the furthest reaches of the county line, gathered momentum, picking up speed like a snowball rolling downhill. They were no longer just on the distant edges of the territory. They crept closer, biting at the heels of the residential areas, leaving their mark less than a mile from the first scattered houses of the town proper. And the destruction? It had escalated beyond simple broken fences. Now, entire barns were hit by a tornado that spared everything but the structure itself. Support beams, thick as a man's chest, wrenched from their moorings, splintered and twisted like kindling. Roofs caved in, shattered by an unimaginable force that burst through them from within or impacted from above. The air around these scenes was not just quiet. It was dead, hushed. The very sound sucked from it, leaving behind only the chilling evidence of raw, primal power. Jack personally visited every new site, his boots sinking into the churned earth, his breath fogging in the crisp autumn air. He crouched low, his eyes, usually so keen and practiced, strained to make sense of the chaos. And that's when he found them. Prints. Not paw prints, not exactly. They were too large for any local animal he knew, even the biggest black bears that occasionally lumbered through. And they were definitely not human. These were elongated with a splayed, almost webbed quality, ending in the impressions of thick, blunt claws. In the slick mud he saw deep gouges. Something incredibly heavy and sharp dragged itself across the ground, leaving furrows that looked like a plow had gone through, only deeper, more brutal. The soil was undisturbed around them, no sign of a large animal walking or running, just these strange, brutal drag marks, the earth itself torn. He picked up a handful of dirt, letting it sift through his fingers, feeling the strange grit of it, like fine sand, but coarser, darker. The smell of fear, metallic, faintly musky, hung heavy in the air, clinging to his clothes like a shroud. The town, once a bastion of peace, was now a cauldron of fear. The easygoing smiles had vanished, replaced by pinched faces and wary eyes. The whispers had grown into a chorus, a low, constant hum of dread. People dragged out old tales from the dusty attics of their minds, stories their grandparents had told them around crackling fires on winter nights. Tales of things that haunted the deep woods, of old curses and disappearing folk. Jack, a pragmatic man, tried to dismiss it, keeping his mind locked in the realm of the rationale. He was a man of facts, of evidence, of what he could see and touch. But even he acknowledged the creeping tendrils of irrationality that wrapped themselves around the town. He saw it in the way folks nervously clutched their rosaries, in the crucifixes that suddenly appeared above doorways, in the bundles of dried herbs hung from window frames. He heard it in the hushed conversations at the general store, about forest demons and things that walk on two legs but are not men. It was unsettling. This regression, this leap into the ancient darkness, and Jack felt it pressing in on him too, making the air thick and hard to breathe. The calls to the sheriff's office intensified, the phone ringing at all hours of the night. Farmers, homesteaders, even some of the closer residents, all reported the same things. The unearthly howls, closer now, sometimes vibrating right through the floorboards. And shadows, huge fleeting shadows. People swore they saw something immense, something impossibly fast and silent, streaking across their fields, vanishing into the tree line before they could properly register it. Old Mr. Fitzwilliam, a notorious early riser, swore he saw a shadow taller than his barn, moving at a speed that defied logic, just before the sun peeked over the eastern ridge. He had dropped his coffee cup right there on the porch, shattering ceramic and scalding hot liquid across his bare feet. Jack tried to reassure them, to tell them it was a deer or a trick of the light, but his voice sounded thin, even to his own ears. He was losing his grip on the narrative, and he knew it. The rational explanations ran out. Desperate, Jack decided on a more aggressive approach. He ordered a dozen high-definition trail cameras, the kind hunters used, with infrared capabilities and motion sensors. He bought industrial-grade pressure plates and rigged them to portable sirens, hoping to at least spook whatever it was. He spent long, frustrating hours installing them on the most frequently hit farms, hiding them among the dense brush, camouflaging them as best he could. He waited, his hopes thin but persistent. But each attempt ended in failure, a new layer of frustration added to the growing pile. The cameras were either smashed to pieces, the lenses fractured, the memory cards wiped clean, or they simply recorded nothing but the rustle of leaves and the passing of a deer. The alarms? They either went off without explanation, screaming into the empty night only to fall silent just as Jack arrived, or they simply failed to trigger at all, even after a fresh attack. Whatever was out there knew exactly where he put them, understood his intentions, and mocked his efforts with an unnerving intelligence. The feeling of being watched, of being outmaneuvered, grew stronger with each failed attempt. Jack fell into a deep, dark hole of obsession. He spent his nights cruising the back roads, windows down, listening to the unsettling quiet, hoping to catch a glimpse, a sound, anything. His days were spent hunched over maps, staring at grainy photos, trying to make sense of the elusive clues. He ate quick, cold meals at his desk, and sleep became a distant memory, replaced by fitful hours of tossing and turning, his mind racing. His deputies, good men but practical, started to look at him with a mixture of pity and growing concern. They did not have the same wild gleam in their eyes, the same desperate need for answers. They did their job, following his orders, but they did not share his consuming obsession. The townsfolk, too, began to keep their distance, their initial fear morphing into a quiet, unsettling distrust. They wanted answers, and Jack did not provide them. He felt himself becoming isolated, a lone figure standing against an unseen tide, his old world crumbling around him, piece by agonizing piece. He felt it in his gut, a cold, hard certainty that this was not just a rogue predator or some gang of bored vandals. This was something fundamentally different, something beyond the scope of his training, beyond the logical framework of his world. It was ancient, hungry, malevolent. The familiar, comfortable world he knew, the one he had spent his life safeguarding, was a brittle pane of glass, already fractured, threatening to shatter at any moment. The subtle dread had escalated to a full-blown premonition, a gnawing certainty that whatever came, whatever caused this, would fundamentally change everything, leaving ruin in its wake. He was a man standing on the edge of a vast, dark precipice, and the ground beneath his feet slowly, inexorably, gave way. The night hung heavy and damp, a suffocating blanket woven from thick fog and the unsettling quiet that had fallen over the town in recent weeks. The air felt charged, almost electric, humming with an unspoken tension. Stars, usually a comforting scatter of diamonds across the main sky, were too bright, too cold tonight, offering no solace. Jack, unable to shake the gnawing anxiety that had become his constant companion, had pulled himself from his bed despite the leaden weight of exhaustion that clung to his limbs. He slipped on his boots, grabbed his patrol rifle, and headed out alone. He needed to be out there, feeling the pulse of the night, even if that pulse was a slow, terrifying thrum. He drove the outer perimeter roads, the low beam of his headlights cutting tunnels through the swirling mist. His window cracked a sliver, straining to hear anything out of place over the hum of the engine. He was a good 15 miles out, past the last of the scattered homesteads when he saw it. A dark, jagged silhouette against the lesser darkness of the tree line, something profoundly unnatural. It stood where old Mr. Henderson's dairy barn had been, a familiar landmark on his nightly rounds. He slowed the cruiser, his heart thudding a hard, erratic rhythm against his ribs. As he drew closer, the fog parted just for him, revealing the full horror of the scene. This was not just damage. It was an act of raw, unbridled savagery. The barn, a sturdy timber structure built generations ago, had been ripped apart by an invisible giant. The roof had collapsed inward, splintered beams jutting out like broken bones. One entire side wall was gone, simply torn away, leaving a gaping wound. The stench was immediate and overwhelming. Warm, coppery blood, mixed with the sharp, sweet smell of fresh pine and the heavy, sickly odor of ruptured earth. It was an apocalypse for a cowshed, a scene of utter, senseless devastation. Jack killed the engine, the sudden silence deafening. He walked slowly, rifle clutched tight in his hand, towards the ruins. His boots crunched on scattered debris, broken boards, shattered glass, clumps of dark, sticky mud. Inside the hollowed-out shell of the barn, amidst the wreckage and pools of dark, congealing blood, he found them. Claw marks. Not just scratches, but deep, wide gouges carved into the concrete floor, scoring the very foundations. Something had dragged 5 massive steel hooks across the ground, digging in with a force that defied logic. Each mark was easily 6 inches across, with terrifyingly distinct points at the end, radiating outward from a central, impossibly broad pad. Too big for a bear, too powerful for any known predator. These were marks of immense power, of something built for tearing, for destruction on a scale Jack had never witnessed. He ran a gloved finger along one of the grooves, feeling the jagged edges, the cold reality of the damage. His stomach churned. But then came the impossible. He followed the claw marks, tracing their path through the shattered remnants of the barn, expecting them to lead out into the fields, into the forest, anywhere. But they simply stopped, abruptly. There were no tracks leading away, no blood trails from the slaughtered cattle, no broken branches, no disturbed undergrowth, nothing to indicate the passage of a creature large enough to inflict such damage. The ground beyond the barn, wet and soft from the night's dampness, was pristine, untouched. The attacker, after wreaking havoc, simply dissolved into the misty air. Jack stood there, frozen, his mind scrambling to reconcile what his eyes were seeing with everything he knew about the physical world. It was a violation of natural law, an affront to reason. He'd spent decades meticulously tracking, following, finding. Now he was left with a blank slate, an impossible absence. The air felt thin, his lungs burned, and a cold sweat trickled down his back despite the chill of the night. Just as the full weight of the incomprehensible settled over him, his radio crackled to life, making him jump. It was a farmer from the next property over, old Mr. Caldwell, his voice thin and reedy, trembling with a terror that clawed at Jack's insides. "Sheriff? Jack? You out there?" God in heaven, Jack, you won't believe it. I heard it again. That howl, closer this time, right outside my window. And I saw something. A shadow, huge, moving fast, an apparition across my backfield, headed for the deep woods, Jack, towards the ridge. Caldwell's voice broke then, dissolving into a ragged gasp, a half-sob. Jack squeezed his eyes shut for a moment, the images of the destroyed barn and the impossible lack of tracks fusing with the old man's terrified words. He drove back to the station in a haze, the cruiser's tires spitting gravel on the empty roads. His mind raced, desperate to connect the dots, to force the puzzle pieces into some semblance of a recognizable picture. But the absence of tracks, that was the anomaly that screamed loudest, defying every logical construct he possessed. A beast capable of such destruction would leave a trail like a freight train. It did. But there was nothing. The creature simply ceased to exist, vanished into thin air after its bloody work was done. He had dealt with monsters before, but they were always human monsters, or wild animals behaving as animals should. This was something else entirely. Something beyond the rational, beyond the reach of his training, his experience, his very understanding of the natural world. He was a man who had just witnessed the sky turn green and the trees sprout feathers. A new fear, cold and insidious, began to coil in his gut. If he told anyone what he'd truly seen, the impossible claw marks, the vanishing attacker, they would either look at him with pity, convinced he was cracking under the pressure, or they would simply think he was scared, a man undone by the unknown. He was the sheriff, the bastion of order and common sense. He could not afford to be seen as a man who chased apparitions. He understood with a chilling clarity that this investigation, this horrifying revelation, was now his alone. He would pursue it in secret, venturing deeper into a world he did not understand, a world he was now utterly terrified of. The quiet hum of normalcy that he had cherished was not only gone, but it had been replaced by a silence that was far more sinister. The silence of something lurking just beyond the edge of perception, something waiting. And Jack knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that it waited for him. The new attack, so brutal and incomprehensible, finally tipped the scales. Panic, a cold, unreasoning tide, washed over the town. The veneer of small-town calm shattered completely. People barricaded themselves in their homes, locking doors that had not known a key in 50 years, nailing shut windows, drawing curtains thick as shrouds. The playful shouts of children vanished from the streets, replaced by an oppressive silence that screamed louder than any alarm. The idyllic daylight hours, once a symphony of everyday life, now felt brittle, precarious, merely a prelude to the horrors of the night. And Jack, driving his patrol car through the deserted streets, felt the full crushing weight of that fear, absorbing it like a sponge. It seeped into his bones, a cold, clammy dread that never quite lifted. In their desperation, the townsfolk turned to whatever offered even a sliver of hope, dragging out ancient, half-forgotten superstitions. Garlic braids, smelling sharp and pungent, appeared on front porches. Horseshoes were nailed above doorways, their rusted curves warded off evil. Piles of coarse salt, gleaming white and stark, were scattered across thresholds, blurring the line between sidewalk and sanctuary. Jack saw it all. The makeshift charms, the bundles of dried herbs hanging from eaves, the faint smudges of ash on doorframes, signs of desperate rituals performed under the cloak of night. He, a man of empirical evidence and hard facts, knew it was futile, yet a part of him, a small, terrified part, understood the primal need for such gestures. He saw the depth of their despair, the raw, visceral terror that had driven them back to the Dark Ages, seeking protection in symbols against an enemy that defied all explanation. It was a testament to how deeply the fear had burrowed into the heart of the community. Jack pressed on with his own, more modern methods, even as the futility of it gnawed at him. He installed more hidden cameras in the deepest parts of the woods bordering the attack sites, set up laser grids and tripwires that promised to alert him to anything larger than a rabbit. He baited traps with meat, hoping to lure the beast into a cage, or at least onto film. But it was all in vain. The cameras yielded nothing but blurred images, streaks of shadow that were nothing. The laser grids were tripped by a passing deer, the alarms wailing uselessly. The traps remained untouched, the bait rotting slowly in the damp earth. Whatever was out there knew exactly where he put them, understood his intentions, and mocked his efforts with an unnerving intelligence. The feeling of being watched, of being played, grew stronger, more insidious. He felt a chill wind at his back even when no breeze stirred, a sensation of eyes on him from the darkest corners of the woods. The animals, too, sensed the shift, the unnaturalness in the air. Their behavior changed, subtle at first, then undeniably stark. Dogs, usually so eager for a friendly pat, became skittish, their tails tucked low, their eyes wide with unreadable fear. At night they howled at the moon, long, mournful cries that were not the usual canine serenades but something desperate, primal, sensing an impending doom. Cats, normally aloof, became shadows themselves, slinking through yards, their fur bristling, or simply vanished for days only to reappear with haunted eyes. The livestock, even in broad daylight, stood huddled together in their pens, their flanks twitching, their eyes rolling nervously, their low moans a constant, unsettling background hum. It added another layer of quiet horror to the atmosphere, a dreadful naturalness, the very fabric of nature recoiling from the encroaching threat. Even the birds sang less, their chirps replaced by an anxious silence. And then the nights began to truly torture Jack. Sleep, when it came, was not a balm but a torment. He suffered from vivid, horrifying nightmares. He saw enormous, shapeless shadows pursuing him through endless, lightless forests, their forms shifting, blurring, always just out of reach. He heard sounds, too, in those dreams. A wet, tearing noise, flesh being ripped apart, followed by a low, guttural growl that vibrated in his chest. He woke in a cold sweat, his heart hammering against his ribs, his breath ragged. The terror lingered, a clammy residue that clung to him even as the morning sun filtered through his bedroom window. He felt an inexplicable, primitive fear, a dread that had no rational basis, yet was utterly real, utterly suffocating. The nightmares were no longer just dreams. They were an extension of the waking horror, blurring the lines between sanity and madness. With no other leads, no tangible enemy to track, Jack's gaze turned inward, toward the very heart of the town. He started looking at his neighbors, his friends, the familiar faces he saw every day, with a new, unsettling scrutiny. He sought any anomaly, any slight shift in behavior, any hint that one of them was connected to the horror that gripped their town. Old Mrs. Henderson's quietness was a sign of fear, or something else. The mailman's strange route, his occasional detours, were inefficiency or something more sinister. Everyone seemed normal, devastatingly, maddeningly normal, and that only amplified his frustration, his gnawing paranoia. He looked for an unseen presence in a mirror. He knew it was there, but he could not see it. The normalcy itself became suspicious, a mask over something unspeakable. Driven to the edge, knowing that his conventional methods were useless against this unseen, unknowable adversary, Jack made a desperate, gut-wrenching decision. He could not wait for it to make a mistake. He had to force the issue. He would set an ambush himself. He would go out, armed, alone, and wait. He would confront the thing directly, whatever it was. He would be prepared for anything, even the impossible, even the unspeakable. He would bring his rifle, a powerful hunting light, and a thermos of strong coffee. He knew it was a fool's errand, a leap into the dark, but he had no other options left. The mounting dread had coalesced into a cold, hard resolve. He would face it, come what may. He would finally know. And the thought, terrifying as it was, also carried with it a strange, grim relief. The night chosen for the ambush was a moonless canvas of oppressive black. The air, thick with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves, clung to everything, muffling sound, amplifying the quiet dread that had become Jack's constant companion. He had spent hours poring over maps, consulting the subtle patterns of the attacks, choosing his spot with the meticulous care of a hunter stalking elusive prey. He settled himself on a low ridge overlooking the newly devastated Henderson farm, a place where the shadows deepened and the tree line offered excellent cover. His heavy rifle lay across his lap, its cold steel a familiar comfort against the mounting chill in his gut. His heart hammered a nervous drumbeat against his ribs, a frantic rhythm that threatened to betray his presence. It was a raw, primal mix of fear and grim determination, a feeling he had not known since his days as a young man, stalking deer in these same woods. The hours stretched, each minute an eternity. The forest, usually alive with the rustle of unseen creatures, was eerily silent tonight, save for the occasional unsettling creak of a distant branch or the whisper of a breeze through the ancient pines. Every shadow writhed, every faint noise shifted and coalesced into something monstrous. Jack's muscles ached from the tension. His eyes burned from staring into the impenetrable darkness, straining for any movement, any flicker of unnatural light. The cold seeped into his bones, but it was nothing compared to the chill that radiated from his core, a premonition of something truly terrible. He held his breath, listening, waiting. The air grew heavier, thick with anticipation, and then a shiver, not of cold, but of something else, ran down his spine. Then he saw it. A vast, impossibly dark mass detached itself from the deeper shadows of the woods, moving with a predatory grace that belied its immense size. It was huge, taller than any man, massive in a way that defied the known limits of the natural world. Its silhouette was unmistakably bestial, but wrong, fundamentally alien. An elongated muzzle, too long, too pointed, twitched in the darkness. Its fur, if it was fur, was thick and dark, absorbing the faint ambient light. And its eyes, they burned. Not like an animal's eyes reflecting light, but with an internal malevolent glow. Two pinpricks of primal fire that radiated something ancient and deeply unsettling. Its movements were fluid, sharp, predatory, yet strangely silent. A nightmare made flesh. It was like nothing he had ever seen. Nothing he had ever imagined could exist outside of the most fevered nightmares. It was the thing from the farmer's tales, the shadow that looked through windows, the impossible predator. Jack slowly, carefully brought the rifle to his shoulder, the cold butt pressing against his cheek. His finger found the safety, flipped it off with a faint click that sounded deafening in the profound silence. He sighted down the barrel, the crosshairs finding the immense, hulking form. His breath hitched, a strangled gasp caught in his throat. This was it, the moment of truth. He was about to pull the trigger to finally end the terror, to bring this monstrous thing down, when something utterly unexpected happened. The creature stopped, not because it sensed him, but because violent, agonizing convulsions suddenly racked it. It began to thrash, a grotesque dance of immense power and profound pain. It dropped to its knees, its huge paws clutching at its chest, its head thrown back, exposing a thick, corded neck. A sound ripped from its throat, a low, drawn-out moan that was not the howl of a beast, but something far more disturbing. A sound laced with human agony, a guttural cry of profound suffering and overwhelming relief. The monstrous silhouette distorted, rippled, the very air around it twisted. Then came the truly unspeakable horror. The creature's enormous claws, which moments before had seemed like weapons forged in a demon's forge, clamped onto its own massive chest. And with a sickening, wet slurping sound, a sound like a giant tearing a sheet of wet leather, those claws did not tear flesh but began to unfasten something, like a zipper, but slower, more organic, more horrifying. And then, with a slow, agonizing pull, the entire thick, wet hide, the heavy, dark fur of the beast began to peel away. It came off like a heavy, sodden suit, sliding downward, revealing something naked and glistening in the faint light beneath. It landed on the ground with a soft, squelching thud, steaming faintly in the cool night air, and under the discarded skin, covered in strange, almost amniotic fluid, slick and gleaming, stood a man, naked, shivering, his body distorted by the struggle, but unmistakably human. His face, smeared with fluids and an unknown residue, was contorted with a mixture of raw pain and profound, gasping relief. And Jack knew him. He knew that face. It was Thomas Reed, the mayor of Glenwood, the neighboring town a good 10 miles down the highway. The man was panting, sucking in huge gulps of air, his eyes wide and unfocused, but undeniably human. Jack was completely paralyzed. His rifle, forgotten, slipped from his numb fingers, thudding softly to the damp ground. His mind reeled, utterly unable to process what his eyes had just witnessed. This was not some beast man, a werewolf from old legends, cursed to transform under the full moon. This was something far more terrifying, more clinical, more chosen. This was not a curse or magic in the traditional sense. This was a physical, grotesque act, a shedding of an outer layer, a costume revealing the human beneath. It was a controlled process, an intentional act. The implications were a tidal wave, drowning his sanity. He was left with a chilling, nauseating certainty. He was dealing with something that defied every law of nature, every boundary of human comprehension. And it was far, far worse than anything he had ever imagined. Jack remained frozen, utterly numb, for a long minute after Reed, his naked form glistening in the faint moonlight, quickly gathered the sodden, steaming mass of the creature's skin, folded it with surprising care, and slipped it into a large, black canvas bag he'd pulled from beneath a nearby bush. The mayor then simply turned, pulled on a pair of unassuming jeans and a heavy work shirt, and vanished into the tree line, moving with the quiet efficiency of a man on a familiar errand. Jack's world, already teetering on the brink, finally toppled. The calm, predictable reality he had so diligently guarded, the one where the extraordinary did not happen, had disintegrated into a pile of meaningless dust. This was not a curse, a random affliction, or some dark magic. This was something far more sinister, far more rational in its own horrifying way. A controlled, deliberate process. He replayed the scene in his mind over and over, trying to find a flaw, a trick of the light, anything to disprove the grotesque tableau. But it was undeniable. The creature had not become a man. It had shed its monstrous form like an unwanted coat. The mayor had folded the skin, carefully, almost reverently. It was not a spontaneous, agonizing transformation, but a calculated physical act. It was a suit, an obscenely wet, rank-smelling, and terrifyingly real suit. And if it was a suit, something that could be worn and discarded, then the implications were 1,000 times worse than any werewolf legend. This was not a beast driven by instinct. It was a human being, making a choice, using this monstrous form for reasons Jack could not yet fathom. Every single piece of evidence from his past investigations now slotted into place with a horrifying, sickening precision. The torn-apart fences, the shredded livestock, the unbelievable absence of tracks leading away from the scenes of carnage. It all made a terrible, coherent sense. How could something leave tracks if it simply slipped out of its monstrous skin and walked away as a man, leaving no trace but the faint, unsettling scent of raw meat and wild earth? The disappearing into thin air was no magic trick. It was simply a change of clothes. The frustration, the baffling anomalies, the nagging sense of being mocked. It was all suddenly, chillingly clear. He had been looking for a beast when he should have been looking for the hunter who packed away his trophies and walked home for a cup of coffee. The question swirled in his mind like a black tornado. How was this possible? What were these skins? Where did they come from? How many of them were there? And most terrifyingly, why? Why were they doing this? It was not just basic predation. The sheer scale of the attacks, the calculated destruction, implied something far more organized, more cynical. Was it for sport, for food, for something else entirely? Something beyond human motivation? The image of Mayor Reed, a man he knew, a man who spoke at town meetings and shook hands at parades, peeling off a monster's hide, lingered like a rotten taste in his mouth. The line between monster and man had not just blurred, it had been erased entirely. A cold, hard realization settled in Jack's gut. He could not tell a soul, not his deputies, not the town council, not even his own wife. Who would believe him? They would call him insane, a man broken by the strain of the job, driven to delusion by fear. His investigation, if he dared to continue it, had to go deep underground, a secret war waged in the shadows of his own mind. It became a deeply personal, impossibly dangerous quest. He found himself looking at every familiar face in the town with a new, horrifying scrutiny, a paranoid suspicion that curdled in his stomach. The kindly old baker, the gruff but fair mechanic, the quiet librarian, each face now held a hidden possibility, a lurking monster beneath the surface. He felt his sanity fraying, stretched taut between the impossible truth and the need to maintain a veneer of normalcy. This was the turning point, the jagged edge where the story he thought he was living twisted into something else entirely. No longer a simple monster hunt in the misty woods. This had become a psychological thriller, a desperate detective story shrouded in pervasive horror. He was not hunting some mythical beast. He was hunting people. People who had chosen to become monsters by their own will for their own unfathomable reasons. The realization was more terrifying than any fanged nightmare because it implied a malevolent intelligence, a deliberate violation of the natural order that was far more chilling than mere instinct. The feeling of threat grew exponentially, a pervasive, suffocating presence. The people in skins were not some distant, unknown entity. They were among them. They were neighbors, shopkeepers, civic leaders. They walked the streets in daylight, shook hands, offered smiles, all while harboring a monstrous secret. The boundary between us and them did not just blur. It became utterly meaningless. He was trapped in a town where anyone, at any moment, could be the thing that had ravaged the farms, the creature that shed its skin and walked away. He was a mouse caught in a well-lit trap, surrounded by unseen eyes, every move observed, every breath accounted for. The quiet hum of the town, once comforting, now was a low predatory growl, a promise of impending doom from within. The town, once a collection of familiar faces and predictable routines, now looked utterly alien to Jack. Every tree, every porch light, every closed curtain held a new, sinister potential. His mind, unable to rest, endlessly re-examined everything he thought he knew. He spent late nights in his office, not patrolling, but submerged in the dusty archives of the sheriff's department. Old case files, yellowed incident reports, even casual notes from long-forgotten town meetings. He was not looking for evidence of a monster anymore. He was looking for anomalies in the fabric of human behavior. Any hint of unusual activity, unexplained absences, anything that pointed to the presence of them. His gaze, usually straightforward and honest, had become clouded with suspicion, seeing shadows where before there had only been light. He searched for common denominators, a pattern that would expose the silent, insidious spread of this horror. Who were the victims? Were they isolated? Or did they live near someone who exhibited strange habits? He looked for uncharacteristic reclusiveness, for people who seemed to vanish after dark, for those who kept too much to themselves, their lives too neat, too quiet. He analyzed the locations of the attacks, overlaying them on a map of the town's inhabitants, searching for a nexus, a point of origin, a web where the strands of this terrifying secret converged. He felt like a conspiracy theorist, drawing lines between seemingly unrelated events. But the chilling difference was he knew his conspiracy was real. His intuition, once a reliable guide in matters of human mischief, now was a tormented compass, spinning wildly in the new, terrifying landscape. Yet it was all he had. He subtly, cautiously, shadowed a handful of people in town. Their ordinary lives were now tinged with a horrifying potential. The postman, old Mr. Abernathy, always knew exactly who was home and when. The quiet, almost invisible butcher, Elias Thorne, whose small shop often had the freshest cuts, but whose supply chain was less than transparent. Jack sometimes saw Thorne's truck, late at night, pulling out of some desolate back road, its bed covered with a tarp, and a cold dread coiled in Jack's stomach. These small, barely perceptible oddities, once dismissed as quirks of personality, now screamed with unspoken meaning. He started almost unconsciously to mentally divide the town into clean and unclean zones. Areas where the attacks had been most frequent, where the suspicion festered, were the dark spots on his internal map. The town square, once the vibrant heart, now felt like a neutral territory, a fragile truce between the known and the monstrous unknown. But the lines blurred, constantly shifting. The feeling of safety had eroded completely, even within the supposed sanctuary of his own home. He walked through his living room, his hand brushing the familiar worn wood of a table, and felt a jolt of unease, wondering if something truly alien had touched it before him. The world he inhabited was no longer safe. It was merely a temporary stage for an unseen enemy. The constant paranoia, the ceaseless vigilance began to take its toll. Jack barely slept, his nights a jumble of restless tossing and turning, his mind a battlefield of suspicion and fear. He grew irritable, his temper quick, his patience thin. He snapped at deputies, at the few townspeople brave enough to approach him. His relationships, already strained by the unspoken fear permeating the town, grew taut, threatened to snap. How could he trust anyone? How could he share a meal, a conversation, a moment of laughter, when the person across from him was capable of such monstrous acts? He became a phantom in his own life, isolated by a truth too horrifying to share. His loneliness was a cold, constant companion settling on him like a shroud. He noticed the minutiae, the small, almost imperceptible shifts. The butcher, Elias Thorne, had a way of handling certain cuts of meat, a practiced nonchalance that struck Jack as chillingly familiar to the movements he'd glimpsed in the woods. The mailman, Abernathy, knew too much about everyone's comings and goings, delivering not just letters but information. Even his own deputy, a man named Jim who had served loyally for 10 years, had an uncanny knack for being not quite there when incidents occurred, his alibis always too vague, his explanations too convenient. Jack had dismissed it before, seeing Jim's occasional tardiness as nothing more than a personal quirk, but now it felt like a deliberate act of misdirection. A knot of cold dread twisted in Jack's gut. Desperate for confirmation, for anything to validate his terrifying suspicions, Jack began to conduct subtle, almost invisible tests. He casually dropped a false rumor at the diner, something about a new patrol route or a planned stakeout, then observed the reactions of those he suspected. He left a seemingly discarded piece of evidence at a supposed crime scene. A distinctive button, a specific brand of boot print, and waited to see if it vanished, or was moved, or if anyone subtly changed their routine. He watched their faces, their eyes, searching for a flicker of recognition, a hint of complicity, any sign that they knew more than they let on. It was a painstaking, mentally exhausting process, a slow descent into a self-made hell of doubt and terror. But he had to know. He had to. The web, he knew, was vast, and he was already caught within its insidious threads. The methodical, agonizing work of his secret investigation began to yield its chilling harvest. Jack, poring over the scraps of information, the subtle shifts in behavior, the whispered snippets of gossip, finally identified the first confirmed carriers. It started with the postman, old Mr. Abernathy, whose perfect knowledge of everyone's comings and goings, once dismissed as small-town nosiness, now screamed with chilling intent. Jack had seen him more than once. pausing for an impossibly long time by certain mailboxes after dark, his shadow merging with the porch light, before slipping away with an almost unnatural swiftness. Then there was Elias Thorne, the butcher. His shop, which always boasted the freshest, most abundant cuts of beef and pork, drew its supply from a source Jack could never pinpoint. Thorne simply shrugged, mumbling about a new supplier out east. But the faint, sickly sweet smell that sometimes clung to his clothes, a scent of blood mixed with something wild and unknown, set Jack's teeth on edge. Their eyes, once unremarkable, now held a strange, distant quality when Jack looked too long. They saw beyond him, into some far-off predatory landscape. A cold shudder, not of fear but of profound recognition, ran through Jack. A terrifying pattern began to emerge, not just in their identities, but in their roles within the community. These were not random individuals. The mailmen controlled information, knew who was home, who was away, who received what. The butcher controlled the town's food supply, the flow of meat, the very sustenance of the community. Jack found a network of other seemingly innocuous individuals. The quiet, unassuming foreman at the local lumber mill, whose nightly logs accounted for every tree cut in the surrounding forests, and the manager of the only gas station, who knew every vehicle passing through. They occupied key strategic positions within the town's ecosystem. It was not a random cluster. It was a deliberate, cunning strategy. It was a net slowly, silently tightening around the throat of the town, woven by unseen hands. But the most shocking discovery, the one that twisted a knot of ice in Jack's gut, was the subtle yet undeniable evidence pointing to his own deputy. Jim. Loyal, dependable Jim. Jack had started reviewing Jim's old patrol logs, cross-referencing them with the times and locations of the attacks. Too many unexplained absences. Too many shifts where Jim claimed to be patrolling one area, only for an incident to occur in another just out of his theoretical reach. There were inexplicable gaps in his memory when questioned about certain nights, a vague, almost rehearsed shrug of the shoulders, and the small sabotages, the malfunctioning camera Jack had installed, the accidental erasure of a piece of footage from a town's security feed. Jack had dismissed them as unfortunate coincidences, an overloaded system, or Jim's usual clumsiness. Now he saw the chilling premeditation, the careful, almost invisible hand of sabotage. Jim's eyes, too, now held that same unsettling stillness, that knowing calm. The realization was a punch to the gut, leaving Jack breathless and utterly alone. Jack finally grasped their terrifying strategy. They were not killing people openly, not in large numbers, not in a way that would spark mass hysteria or attract outside attention. Their goal was not wanton destruction. It was something far more insidious, more permanent, the slow, imperceptible subjugation of the town. Integration, control from within. They operated silently, subtly, weaving themselves into the very fabric of the community, taking root like a parasitic vine. They established their dominance not through overt violence, but through a chilling, almost mundane infiltration. A quiet takeover that left the town hollowed out from the inside before anyone realized what was happening. It was an insidious, patient form of conquest, far more terrifying than any open war. The creeping horror that had been building in Jack's chest now swelled into an all-encompassing, suffocating dread. The town, his town, the one he had sworn to protect, no longer belonged to its human inhabitants. It slowly, inexorably fell under the control of these skin-wearers. It was not an invasion from outside. It was an internal rot, a malignant cancer that had metastasized to the very core of society, spreading unseen beneath the surface of everyday life. He saw the smiles of his neighbors, heard their polite chatter, and felt a profound, gut-wrenching nausea. They lived among them, indistinguishable, until they chose to reveal their monstrous truth. The sense of isolation became a physical weight, pressing down on him, crushing him. He could not trust anyone, not his colleagues, not the town elders, not the man who poured his coffee every morning. Every face, every familiar voice became a potential threat, a hiding place for a monstrous secret. He stood in the center of a hostile circle, surrounded by polite smiles and hidden fangs, utterly alone in his terrible knowledge. The air itself crackled with their unseen presence, their quiet observation. He tried, desperately, to find a rational explanation. Was it a cult? Some twisted sect driven by dark rituals? A new, horrifying virus, transforming people into something else? A collective delusion, a mass hysteria triggered by fear. But each time his mind recoiled, rejecting the easy answers. Each time he was pulled back to the horrifying reality of what he had witnessed in the woods. A man, a civic leader, peeling off a monster's hide as easily as a coat. It was literally, physically, exactly what he had seen, and that brutal, unshakable reality was far more terrifying than any theory, because it was true. And it meant he was truly, irrevocably, alone in a town already lost. The chilling clarity of his discoveries, the terrifying confirmation of his worst fears, had shattered the last vestiges of Jack's composure. Paranoia, now a suffocating shroud, clung to him with every breath. If his deputy, his trusted partner, was one of them, then who was not? The question screamed in his mind, echoing off the walls of his skull. The suspicion, cold and venomous, inevitably turned inward, toward the last sanctuary, the last piece of his life he had not subjected to his terrifying scrutiny, his own home, his own wife, Emily. The thought was a sickening coil in his gut, but he could not escape it. He had to know. He could not live with the uncertainty, with the gnawing doubt that had consumed his entire world. He drove home in a daze, the familiar route blurring before his eyes. The house, a cozy two-story nestled among maples and oaks, felt alien, hostile. He walked through the front door. The familiar scent of Emily's cooking, of polished wood and old books, now seemed tainted, overlaid with a faint, almost imperceptible tang of something else, something wild and rank. He moved through the rooms like a specter, his heart thudding a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. He started in the kitchen, then the living room, his hands shaking as he pulled open drawers, ran his fingers under couches, searching for... what? A misplaced item? A secret compartment? He did not know, but an awful certainty guided him, pulling him toward the darkest corner of his domestic world. His feet carried him down the creaking wooden steps to the basement, a place usually reserved for old boxes, forgotten tools, and the hum of the furnace. The air was cooler down here, and the light from the bare bulb cast long, dancing shadows. He moved deliberately, his eyes scanning every nook, every cranny, and then he saw it. Tucked away, almost perfectly camouflaged behind a stack of firewood and beneath a dusty tarp, in a small, concealed alcove he had never paid much attention to. A bundle. He reached for it, his fingers brushing against something heavy, something oddly resilient. He pulled the tarp away. It was a skin, a large, dark, matted hide, folded carefully, meticulously upon itself. It was heavy, slick to the touch, and still faintly damp, recently discarded. A thick, unsettling aroma rose from it, a primal stench that slammed into Jack's senses with the force of a physical blow. It was the same scent he'd smelled at the ravaged farms, the unmistakable tang of raw blood, rich and coppery, mixed with the damp, earthy smell of the deepest woods, and something else. Something wild and animalistic that made the hairs on his arms stand on end. His breath caught in his throat. It was the skin of the creature from the woods, the one he had seen peeled away from Mayor Reed. Only this one was different. Just as monstrous, but more intimately familiar. He dropped to his knees, his hand still resting on the heavy, damp fur, his mind reeling, trying to deny what his senses were screaming at him. And in that precise, horrific moment, a soft sound from the top of the basement stairs made him freeze. He looked up, his eyes wide and wild. Emily stood there, silhouetted against the pale light filtering down from the kitchen. Her face, usually so warm and open, was etched with profound sadness, weary resignation. But there was no surprise in her eyes. No fear, only an ancient, unsettling wisdom, a deep knowledge that settled upon her features like a timeless mask. She looked at him, at the skin, at his broken face, and slowly, deliberately she nodded. A single, slow nod that confirmed his most unspeakable, unimaginable fear. "We don't hunt humans, Jack," she said, her voice soft, calm, utterly devoid of malice. Yet it vibrated with a chilling finality that turned his blood to ice. "Not without need. We don't kill them for sport. But humans are temporary, fickle. They build, they destroy, they forget. We are not." Her words were not a confession. They were a statement of undeniable truth, spoken with the quiet authority of someone who had seen countless cycles of life and death, of rise and fall. She stepped closer, her bare feet silent on the cold concrete floor, stopping just a few feet from him, her gaze unwavering. She looked at him with those ancient eyes, eyes that were still Emily's, yet vastly more, and explained their philosophy. They were not cursed, she said. They were not monsters in the human sense of the word. They were the true inhabitants, the ancient ones, the evolved ones, bound to this land not by ownership, but by existence. She spoke of cycles, of humanity being merely a transient phase, a fleeting moment in the long, slow turning of the earth. "We are eternal," she said, her voice a whisper now, yet ringing with undeniable power. "We are the survivors. We adapt. We endure." And then she finished her explanation with a prophecy, delivered without a hint of threat, simply as a statement of inevitable fact, a grim promise. "When the time comes, you will understand this yourself, Jack, and you will accept it." That moment, the sight of Emily, his wife, standing before him, connected to this unspeakable horror, was the absolute breaking point. Everything Jack had ever believed in, every foundational stone of his world, his marriage, his home, the very concept of safety and truth, splintered and dissolved into nothingness. His own house, the sanctuary where he had found comfort and peace, was permeated by this monstrous lie. His life, his entire existence, had been a carefully constructed illusion. He was trapped, utterly and completely, with no escape, no retreat, no weapon against a betrayal so profound it defied comprehension. His entire being felt hollowed out, defenseless, caught in a nightmare from which there was no waking. The revelation of Emily's true nature had left Jack utterly hollowed out, a man made of glass shards and echoes. The cold dread that had permeated his existence for weeks had solidified into a rock-hard knot of despair. He paced the floor of his living room, the skin still a damp, rank-smelling bundle on the basement floor, a constant reminder of the monstrous lie that had defined his life. He was completely, irrevocably isolated. How could he trust anyone when the woman he loved, the partner who had shared his bed and his life, was part of this unspeakable conspiracy? The very air in his home, once a comfort, now felt thick with deception, stifling his breath. His world had shrunk to the confines of his own paranoia, a desperate, solitary struggle against an enemy that walked in familiar skin. Driven by an instinct he could not name, part desperate search for answers, part suicidal yearning for confrontation, Jack slipped out of the house as the first faint hint of pre-dawn gray began to paint the eastern sky. He moved like an apparition, his steps muffled by the damp leaves that carpeted the forest floor. He walked with no destination in mind, only a desperate need to find something, anything, beyond the crushing weight of his home's newfound horror. His path led him, as if by an invisible thread, to the very edge of town, where the manicured lawns gave way to the tangled, shadowed depths of the vast Maine woods. He stopped at the familiar boundary line, his eyes scanning the impenetrable darkness, waiting for a sign, an echo of the nightmare that had consumed him. And then he saw it. Another one. A massive, hulking silhouette detached itself from the deeper shadows, moving with that same impossible grace, that same predatory stillness. It was different from the one he had seen Mayor Reed shed, larger, or with a slightly different cast to its monstrous form, but undeniably the same terrifying species. His breath hitched in his throat, a cold fear gripping him. He raised his rifle, an automatic, almost instinctual movement, the cold steel a heavy, familiar weight in his hands. The creature stopped, its burning eyes fixing on Jack. There was no surprise in its gaze, no fear, only profound, almost weary recognition. It took a slow step forward, then another, until it stood in the faint, ethereal glow of the nascent dawn. And then, slowly, deliberately, it began to change. Not with the frantic, agonizing convulsions he had witnessed before, but with a fluid, almost mournful ease. The dark, matted fur rippled, peeled away from muscle and bone, slipping downward like heavy, wet cloth. The sickening, slurping sound, though quieter this time, was no less horrifying, as the vast, steaming hide collapsed onto the forest floor. The figure that stood revealed beneath was human. Naked, vulnerable, yet radiating a profound, unsettling calm. And Jack knew him. His world, already shattered, splintered into a million more agonizing pieces. It was Jim, his best friend, his deputy. The man he had trained with, laughed with, covered for the better part of a decade. The man he had confided in, relied on. This moment was the final, devastating confirmation of just how deeply, how intimately these skin-wearers had infiltrated his life, his very being, his colleagues, his friends, his wife. They were everywhere. Jim stood there, his body damp and glistening in the first pale light of dawn, his eyes tired, yes, but completely devoid of fear. There was only understanding in them, a deep, sorrowful pity that twisted Jack's gut. But beneath the regret, a core of unshakable, almost cold resolve shone through. He bent down, picked up the discarded skin, and began to fold it with the same practiced efficiency Jack had seen in Mayor Reed. Then Jim straightened, the heavy, wet bundle of skin in his hands. He took a single step forward, extending his arm, offering it to Jack. The skin, dark and matted, looked identical to the one Jack had found in his basement. It was heavy, strangely warm, and it carried that same unmistakable scent. The raw, metallic tang of blood mixed with the damp earth and wild herbs. It was not just an object, it was a key, a morbid, terrifying invitation, a gateway to their world. Jim's voice was calm, steady, without a hint of threat, merely stating an undeniable fact. "You've seen how it all works, Jack. You know the truth now." He gestured with the skin, holding it out, a silent, weighty proposition. "Now you have to decide, with us or against us." It was an ultimatum that felt like a death sentence, a choice that was no choice at all. Jack stood there, the weight of the offered skin a physical pressure in the air between them, the taste of ash in his mouth. He suddenly understood the utter futility of resistance. If he tried to fight them, if he tried to expose them, what would happen? The town would be a graveyard, emptied of its human inhabitants, and he would be left alone among the ruins, hunted, pursued, ultimately destroyed. If he remained human, if he clung to the remnants of his old life, he would become a helpless pawn, an object of their control, or simply another victim for their silent, hungry dominion. Both options meant the complete loss of himself, of everything he was. The path forward led only into the abyss. And Jack, staring at the skin, staring at his friend's unflinching eyes, finally understood that he had already fallen. Jack stumbled back to his house, the offered skin from Jim still a phantom weight in his hands, though in reality it lay back at the edge of the woods, a chilling testament to the choice he now faced. The sun had finally broken the horizon, painting the sky in pale, indifferent hues of orange and pink. But for Jack, the world remained cloaked in an eternal, impenetrable night. He spent the remainder of the morning, and then the long, agonizing hours of the day, in a state of tormented limbo. He paced his living room, a restless phantom in his own home, searching for a third path, a hidden door, an escape route from the nightmare that had swallowed his life whole. But there was none. Every direction led to horror, death, annihilation, or a complete and utter submission, a terrifying erasure of his very self. His mind became a brutal battleground, his principles clashing with a primal, desperate instinct for survival. His human conscience, his sense of duty as a sheriff, his ingrained values of justice and protection, screamed at him to resist, to fight, to cling to the last shreds of his humanity. But another voice, ancient and cunning, whispered to him, a seductive, hungry murmur. It spoke of strength, of belonging, of the end of constant fear and gnawing paranoia. It offered a new form of existence, a raw, powerful connection to the earth, a release from the limitations of his frail human flesh. It promised an end to the agonizing loneliness, the terrifying isolation. The whisper, though dark, was strangely comforting, a siren song to his terrified, exhausted soul. He conjured memories of his past life, of the man he had been. Jack Hansen, the steady sheriff, the loving husband, the decent man. He saw himself walking these familiar streets, nodding to neighbors, solving mundane problems, believing in the simple goodness of ordinary life. He recalled the warmth of Emily's hand in his, the scent of wood smoke on a cold winter's night, the laughter shared over a beer with Jim. He clung to these images, these anchors to his humanity, but they felt distant, faded, like photographs yellowed by time. They seemed small, insignificant, almost pathetic against the monumental, terrifying reality that now confronted him. His ideals, his attachments, his very sense of who he was, felt flimsy, ethereal, unable to withstand the crushing weight of the choice before him. The skin, the one he had found in his own basement, the one Jim had offered, was more than just a physical object. It was a symbol, a dark, potent symbol of absolute renunciation. To put it on was to shed not just his clothes, but his very soul, to step across an irreversible threshold into an alien existence. It was a ticket to survival, yes, but at the cost of everything that made him Jack Hansen. His empathy, his compassion, his human spirit. It was the ultimate horrifying bargain, a Faustian pact with a monstrous primal force. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to his core, that once he stepped into that skin, there would be no going back. The bridge would burn behind him, leaving him adrift in a bottomless abyss. As the first faint streaks of the next dawn touched the sky, after a night that had been a living hell, a relentless siege of internal demons, Jack made his decision. It was not a choice born of conviction, but a slow, agonizing capitulation. He no longer fought. He simply accepted. The last flickering ember of human hope in his eyes, the light of his own spirit, slowly, irrevocably extinguished. His jaw was tight, his eyes hollow, reflecting nothing but the cold, indifferent light of the new day. He was empty. He went down to the basement, his steps heavy, purposeful. He retrieved the skin from its hiding place. It felt monstrously heavy in his hands, a clammy, dense weight. The rank smell of blood and damp earth was stronger now, a suffocating presence. He held it up, its form a terrifying parody of life, and then, with profound revulsion, but also a strange, almost magnetic pull, he began to pull it on. The sensation was immediate, overwhelming and utterly nauseating. It felt cold and slimy at first, then rapidly warmed, molding itself to his flesh. It was not like putting on a garment. It merged with him, sinew by sinew, hair by hair. He felt a wet, pulling sensation, a strange internal stretching. His own skin stretched and reshaped from within. A wave of nausea washed over him, bile rising in his throat, but he fought it down. As the final parts of the skin enveloped him, he felt a strange, almost narcotic rush of power surge through his limbs, a heightened sense of strength and solidity. His muscles felt dense, his bones heavier, stronger. It was wrong, utterly wrong, yet undeniably potent. And with the physical change came the terrifying, profound shift in his consciousness. The human emotions, the fear, the sorrow, the lingering regret dulled, receded like a tide pulling away from the shore. In their place, new sensations surged forward. A keen, almost painful hunger, an animalistic clarity of instinct, a thrilling, unexplainable sense of anticipation. His mind, once so complex, so burdened by human thought, became simpler, sharper, focused on the immediate, the primal. The world, once a place of nuanced feelings and moral dilemmas, now presented itself as a landscape of smells, sounds, and the raw, undeniable pulse of life and death. Jack Hansen, the sheriff, dissolved, remade into something ancient, something else entirely. The first hesitant rays of the true dawn, weak and watery, filtered through the eastern tree line, painting the frost-kissed landscape in shades of pale rose and bruised violet. Jack stepped out onto the porch of his home, the new heavy skin feeling as natural and alien as a second skin. It was still damp, still carried the earthy, rank scent of blood and wildness, a scent that now clung to him. That was him, His eyes, once the steady, comforting blue of a Maine sky, were no longer human. They gleamed in the weak morning light, catching the nascent sun with a strange, predatory glint. The gaze was detached, distant, unsettlingly empty of human empathy, yet filled with a raw, hungry awareness. In the reflection of the living room window, he saw not the beast, not the monster of nightmares, but a man wearing a perfectly tailored suit of monstrous hide. It was still him, yet it was not. A horrific, perfect mimicry. He understood now. The beastly form, the powerful, furred shell, was merely a mask, a physical manifestation of a deeper, far more profound transformation. The true metamorphosis had occurred not in his flesh, but within the deepest chambers of his soul, his very consciousness. His human emotions, his compassion, his moral compass, his innate sense of justice, all of it had withered, sloughed away like old skin, making way for something ancient, something cold, and infinitely more adaptable. He was no longer a man. He was a hunter, a survivor, a creature of pure instinct, perfectly attuned to this new, brutal world. The complex, agonizing thoughts of a human mind were replaced by a sharp, clear focus on the here and now, on the tangible, the edible, the territory. He walked down the short gravel path that led from his porch to the quiet, tree-lined street. His steps were silent, measured, imbued with a new, unsettling confidence. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty. The air, crisp with the chill of morning, felt alive, vibrant, filled with 1,000 new scents that assaulted his heightened senses. The faintest trace of a rabbit's path, the rich, damp odor of decaying leaves, the subtle, musky scent of other hidden things. Sounds were sharper, more distinct. The distant rustle of a squirrel in the oak branches, the almost imperceptible creak of a house settling, the faint, deep thrum of the earth itself. The world around him, once a familiar backdrop, had opened itself to him anew, revealing layers of existence he had never perceived, a raw, elemental tapestry of life and death. As he reached the street, a figure emerged from the porch of the house across the way, then another from the house next door, and another further down the street. One by one, hesitantly at first, then with increasing certainty, like figures drawn by an unspoken signal, the residents of the town began to emerge from their homes. Their movements were quiet, their forms still shrouded in the lingering shadows of dawn. And as they stepped into the pale light, Jack saw them, each and every one. They were all in their own skins, heavy and damp, steaming faintly in the cool morning air. Some were larger, some smaller, some darker, some a lighter shade of matted fur. But all were new, all were alien, all were ready. Their eyes, like his, gleamed with a predatory, detached light, reflecting a shared, ancient wisdom. The town, once his peaceful haven, was no longer his. It was theirs, and he was finally, irrevocably, one of them. The dawn, silent and indifferent, broke over a world transformed,